I often wonder if we knew the end was coming, if we felt it in our bones, even before the first bombs fell. The signs were there. After all, nations stockpiling weapons, alliances shifting like sand in the wind, leaders speaking of peace while preparing for war. We were living under the shadow of something immense and inevitable, a gathering storm that no one could stop. The war began not with a bang, but with whispers. Whispers of territorial disputes, economic blockades, and secret treaties. The usual sparks that had always led to war. But this time, the stakes were different. This time, we had atomic weapons. And once they were unleashed, there would be no going back. The first strikes had started with a single bomb, dropped on a small, contested territory by a nation desperate to assert its dominance. I remember hearing the news over the radio, the reporter's voice trembling as he described the explosion. "It is said," he stammered, "that the city is gone, entirely gone. Nothing remains but ash and silence." The world seemed to hold its breath. We had all known it was possible. Holson himself had warned us of this, but knowing and seeing are two very different things. The images that followed were horrific. Blackened ruins, skeletal trees, shadows burned into walls where people had stood just moments before. And yet, the horror of it wasn't enough to stop what came next. Within days, retaliatory strikes were launched. One bomb became 2, then 4, then 10. Cities fell like dominoes, each explosion brighter and louder than the last. The sky itself seemed to mourn, darkening with smoke and ash until the sun was little more than a dim, orange glow. I can still remember the sound of those bombs, even though I was far from the battlefields. It was a low, guttural roar, as if the earth itself was crying out in pain. The air smelled of burning metal and despair. Life in the shadow of war, for those of us not directly caught in the blasts, life became a strange, surreal nightmare. We lived in constant fear of the next bomb, the next city to disappear from the map. People fled the cities in droves, seeking safety in the countryside, though there was none to be found. The fields withered under the fallout, the rivers turned toxic, and the very air we breathed seemed tainted. And yet, even in the face of such devastation, humanity clung stubbornly to its routines. Farmers planted crops that wouldn't grow. Teachers held lessons for children who would never live to adulthood. I continued writing, though I often wondered who would be left to read my words. It was during this time that I began to truly understand the depth of what we had done. We had not just unleashed destruction, we had destroyed the very fabric of our existence. The cities we had built, the technologies we had created, the connections we had forged, all of it was unraveling. And for what? Power? Pride? Holson's words haunted me during those days. This power was meant to set us free, not to destroy us. The war escalates as the war dragged on. It became clear that no one was winning. The bombs fell indiscriminately, leveling entire nations. But they didn't bring the victories their creators had envisioned. Instead, they created a world of rubble and ruin, a wasteland where survivors scavenged for food and shelter amid the wreckage. Leaders who had once spoken confidently about the necessity of war now appeared pale and haggard, their voices trembling as they addressed the dwindling populations. The phrase, "acceptable losses," was repeated endlessly, as if saying it enough times could make the devastation seem reasonable. But there was nothing reasonable about what we had done. Cities that had stood for centuries, centers of culture, history, and humanity, were wiped from existence in seconds. Libraries burned, artworks turned to ash, entire civilizations erased by the push of a button. And still the bombs kept falling. Survivors and resistance in the midst of all this destruction. There were those who refused to give in to despair. Small groups of survivors banded together, creating makeshift communities in the ruins. They shared food, told stories, and tried to create a sense of normalcy in a world that had lost all meaning. I joined one such group after my city was destroyed. We lived in an abandoned train station, scavenging supplies from the nearby wreckage. There were about 20 of us, men, women, and children, each carrying the scars of the war in our own way. Some had lost their families. Others bore the physical marks of radiation sickness. But despite everything, there was a quiet resilience among us, a determination to keep going. We listened to the radio when we could, though the broadcasts grew fewer and more desperate as the weeks went on. One day, we heard a report that shook us to our core. The world's largest cities had been targeted in a final, desperate attempt to end the war. London, New York, Tokyo, Moscow, gone in an instant. After that, the broadcast stopped altogether. The end of the war ended not with a treaty, but with silence. The nations that had waged it no longer had the resources or the people to continue fighting. The last bombs fell on empty cities, their devastation echoing across landscapes already reduced to ash. I remember the day we realized it was over. The skies were quiet, the air still. We ventured out of the train station cautiously, unsure if it was a lull or the end. We were alive, but we were not whole. No one was. Reflections on the war looking back. It is hard to make sense of what happened. The war was not just a conflict. It was an unraveling, a complete breakdown of everything we had built as a species. We had created tools of unimaginable power, and in our arrogance, we had used them to destroy ourselves. Holson, I later learned, had died in the early days of the war. He passed away quietly in his sleep, his heart giving out under the strain of his own guilt. I often wonder if he found peace in those final moments, or if he died with the same questions that haunt me now. Why do we do it? Could it have been avoided? And what comes next? Looking ahead, awakening in the ruins, the world that emerged from the ashes of the atomic war was not a world I recognized. It was quieter, emptier, and infinitely more fragile. But even in the midst of this desolation, there were whispers of hope. Survivors began to rebuild, not just their homes, but their understanding of what it meant to live. They spoke of a new way forward, one that would not repeat the mistakes of the past. In the next chapter of this story, the survivors grapple with the weight of what has been lost and the possibilities of what could still be gained. From the ruins, a new vision of humanity begins to take shape.